Today's story carries the kind of weight that's felt long after the last word falls, set under skies heavy with winter wind, across plains that remember every footprint. There, in a place where grudges ride hard and truth arrives slow, two lives collided. And it all began with something small, a ride into town. Yet it sparked a reckoning no one could outrun. Before we kick off this adventure, don't forget to hit like on the video and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. By late afternoon, Green River sat beneath a veil of red dust sweeping in from the wide flats. That dry, restless wind rattled loose shutters, kicked tin cans along the street, and coated every tongue with the taste of iron and road grit. Folks lingered along the wooden walkways, hats tugged low, watching the storm roll in slow and heavy, staining the town in a copper-toned haze. That was when Ishka Rayne arrived. She walked straight down the center of town on quiet moccasins, chin lifted, shoulders squared, even as the wind tugged strands loose from her dark braids. All she carried was a faded canvas pouch at her hip, patched, scorched by sun, and worn thin like the rest of her belongings. Her people had moved south months earlier, yet she stayed behind, drifting from creek to campfire, surviving off cattail roots, trout pulled from cold streams, and whatever work she could trade. The prairie reshaped her into something lean, sharp-eyed, and unbreakable, an Apache woman who knew how to find water in a canyon gone dry, and how to read fear in a man's eyes before he ever spoke. But Green River was different. Green River didn't just see her, it measured her. The moment she stepped through the door of the general store, the room quieted like someone had pinched a lantern flame. Two ranch wives froze beside stacked beans. Grundy Rake stopped jingling coins in his palm, and Decker Quinn, halfway through tying a sack of flour, paused as though movement might draw trouble. Their stares held curiosity, caution, and that cold edge reserved for anyone who didn't match their idea of belonging. Ishka kept her gaze forward. She had long learned that dignity walks best in silence. She took what she needed, cornmeal, twine, a small tin of salve, and paid without lifting her eyes. She stepped back into the dust-hazed light, hoping to cross the porch before trouble found her. Trouble arrived anyway. Halfway down the steps, 3 men blocked her path. Varric Holt, Crowden Merrick, and a thick-shouldered drifter named Ruck Baylor, men who lived their lives never being told no. Voss Emberfall's crew. Everyone in town knew their boots, their whiskey breath, and the arrogance stitched into every step. "Well now," Varric drawled, looking her over slow. "Didn't expect to see you back. Thought your kind cleared out." Crowden leaned against the post, smirking. "Voss doesn't want Apache shadows roaming near the land he's fixing to buy." "You best learn your place," Rook muttered, stepping closer, "before something unpleasant happens." The wind shifted, pushing grit across the porch. Ishka didn't move. "This ground belongs to nobody," she told them, voice steady. "And I come to harm no one." Ruck barked a laugh. "Hear that? She thinks she's got a say." Boots shuffled, joints cracked, a breath of danger tightened the air. Then the boardwalk creaked. A heavier step, deliberate, unhurried, and a figure rose behind them like a wall settling into place. Kael Thornridge. Tall, dust still clinging to his coat, a glove dangling from one hand after mending fences since sunrise. He didn't reach for his gun. He didn't need to. "She giving you boys trouble?" Kael asked, voice low enough to cut through the wind. The 3 stiffened. Varric cleared his throat. "Nothing like that. Just talking." "Didn't sound like talk." Kael stepped forward until he stood beside Ishka, not shielding her, but standing with her, as if her place beside him needed no permission. His eyes locked on Varric. "Let the lady pass." Crowden muttered something, but one look from Kael emptied his courage. They backed away, boots thudding rough against the boards as they slipped into the dusty street. Ishka released a breath she didn't realize she was holding. Kael dipped his hat. Not grand, not showy, just respectful. Something subtle shifted between them, like a thread drawn tight by wind neither could ignore. She walked into the open street again, the sun stretching long shadows across the dirt like the day refused to end. Her steps carried pride, but beneath them lived a quiet exhaustion she tried not to reveal. Kael followed at a distance, as a man does when something draws him without explanation. He noticed the tired grip on her pouch, the way her shoulders carried everything she owned. Most men would have let her walk on. Kael wasn't most men. When she reached her small saddle pony, he closed the gap. "You held up well back there," he said. "I've had practice." He nodded, understanding more than he questioned. Wind loosened a braid. She brushed it aside with a scarred hand. Work scars, survival scars, not delicate ones. "If you need shelter," Kael said, voice steady like a man offering water from his last canteen. "Or honest work. My ranch could use another hand." She froze, not from fear, but from habit, the kind learned when walls collapse too easily. Then she turned, dark eyes thoughtful. She didn't say yes, but she didn't walk away either. The look she gave him was the kind carried by someone who had been let down by men before, and by life far more times than she ever admitted. "Why?" she asked. Kael Thornridge lifted one shoulder, gaze drifting toward the distant hills rather than toward her. "Because you look like someone who works hard," he said. "Someone who means what they say. And this ranch is falling apart faster than I can patch it." That simple truth disarmed her more than any sweet talk ever could. Still, the distrust settled deep in her bones didn't fade easily. "Apache women don't walk into a white man's house without consequences," Ishka Rayne replied, her voice barely above the wind. "It has never ended well for us." Kael didn't argue, didn't soften his stance, didn't try to justify anything. "Then don't walk into my house," he said quietly. "Just onto my land. There's space enough without crossing a doorway you're not ready for." That stopped her. Men in Green River were known for demanding things: compliance, silence, gratitude. Kael demanded nothing. He assumed nothing. And for once, she wasn't being talked over. She studied him like someone reading tracks at dusk, searching for danger buried beneath dust. All she found was a worn-down rancher trying to hold on to something that shouldn't slip away. "Only for a week," she said at last. Kael nodded once, the kind of agreement made between equals. "A week it is." They mounted up, Kael on a rugged sorrel gelding, Ishka on her small desert-bred pony built for endurance rather than pride. The wind eased as they rode beyond town, the dust storm fading into a golden hush stretching across the prairie. A mile out, Kael's land came into view, thirsty earth, grass thinned by drought, fence posts leaning like tired men in the wind. A barn sagged at the roofline, its beams slouched with age. The house stood crooked, porch half broken, door leaning wrong. It wasn't wealth, it wasn't comfort, but it was honest. Ishka felt something loosen in her chest, relief she hadn't expected. Places like this didn't pretend to be anything more than what they were. They rode through a gate hanging half open, half broken. Dust piled at the steps, tumbling like red powder against the boards. Kael swung off his horse. "You can take the bunkhouse," he said, "old but dry when rain hits." Ishka slid down from her pony, boots thudding against the dirt. She inhaled earth, old timber, and faint sage carried on the night wind. "This place is worn," she murmured. Kael let out a low laugh. "That's a generous way to say it." She didn't smile fully, just the smallest curve at the corner of her mouth. Wind pushed across them, dusty and warm. "1 week," she said again. "I'll stay." For the first time since she walked into Green River, loneliness eased its grip. The first days on Kael Thornridge's land tested pride, patience, and 2 people who had spent years learning not to trust. Ishka rose before dawn, moving through early light with quiet certainty. She hauled water, checked horses, reset the southeast fence line before Kael even stepped outside with coffee in hand. She worked not with words, not with explanation, but with clean, efficient action. Kael kept his distance, watching without hovering. He spoke softly around her, as though volume itself might unsettle something, though fragile was never a word that fit Ishka Rayne. Sometimes he caught himself studying the iron behind her resilience, wondering what fires she had walked through to become this steady. Bram Duskhelm, old as wind-scarred cedar, didn't hide his opinions. "Boss," he muttered on the second morning, "you sure putting an Apache girl on this place is wise? Folks talk, and trouble likes to follow talk." Kael wiped sweat from his brow, shoulders burning from mending fences. "She works hard, that's enough." Bram spat into the dirt. "She's strong, no doubt. Strong ain't the same as safe." Ishka heard every word. She didn't look up, didn't defend herself. Instead, she lifted another fence rail, balanced it, hammered it straight in less than half the time Bram would have taken. His eyebrows twitched. "Girl works quicker'n a foreman with a deadline." Kael grinned under his breath, but it wasn't usefulness that drew him. It was the way she read the land, like sound traveling under soil, like wind teaching secrets. By midweek, even Bram quit doubting. She spotted a loose gate hinge before cattle scattered. She followed faint grass bruising to track down a missing mare. She called a storm coming half a day before the sky darkened, only by how the wind shifted and birds moved. "Girl's got a 6th sense," Bram mumbled. "Not sense," Kael said. "Skill." Ishka pretended not to hear, but her shoulders settled slightly, lighter. On the 4th night, after supper, the wind grew restless again, sharp, unsettled, carrying something wrong. Kael was rinsing tin plates when Ishka stepped to the doorway of the bunkhouse, gaze narrowed toward the dark pastures. "I'm checking the ridge," she said. "Something feels off." "You want company?" "No," she answered softly. "I move better alone." Then she slipped into the tall grass, moonlight catching the braid over her shoulder as she disappeared into the night. Kael stood waiting on the porch, jaw tight, tension coiling across his chest. He didn't call after her. He knew enough not to follow someone who could read danger by the shift of the wind. He hated letting her walk that ridge alone, yet truth was truth. Nobody tracked sign like Ishka Rayne. Minutes stretched into longer ones before she returned, her breath even, her face shadowed, eyes holding something darker than when she had left. "I found tracks," she said. Kael Thornridge straightened. "Animals?" "No. Men. 3 horses. Recent." Cold settled beneath Kael's ribs. "Where?" "Down by the creek. They rode close." Her voice lowered into something like a warning carried through dust. "Too close. They're watching something." Kael didn't need her to explain. Water was life in that part of the country, and Voss Emberfall had been hungry for this land for near a decade. "They'll come again," she said. Kael's jaw worked tight. "Then we'll be ready." And for the first time since she came, it wasn't Kael standing guard over the land. It was them. 2 strangers tied together by the same incoming storm. News traveled faster than horses in those parts, faster than prairie wind. A whisper from a ranch hand, repeated by a clerk, twisted by idle tongues. By the week's end, everyone from the top ridge to the low creek knew Kael Thornridge hired an Apache woman. By first light the next morning, so did Voss Emberfall. He wasn't merely wealthy. He was the kind of man who confused fear with respect, possession with rightful ownership. He ran cattle across miles and graves, bought men by the dozen, and ruined families the same way drought-starved cattle. Folks had a name for him, the Vulture King. He circled where things were weakened, swooping in only when bones were ready to strip. So when he heard Kael had brought Ishka Rayne onto land he'd tried to buy for years, he didn't take it as news. He took it as an insult. Late one blistering afternoon, when the wind lay heavy as a bruise over the ranch, the rumble of hooves broke the quiet. Not one rider, several. The kind of sound that made Bram Duskhelm halt mid-swing with his hammer, and made Kael check the rifle leaning against the porch rail. Ishka was tying bundles of dried grass when she stilled, not out of fear, but that deep alertness born from a life-reading danger before it had a face. 3 riders entered the yard. Dust lifted around them like smoke. The man in front wore a black coat, crisp enough to look like it had never seen sweat or dirt, boots polished like mirrors. Voss Emberfall. His smile was thin and carved with cruelty. "Well," Voss drawled, dismounting with practiced arrogance. "Seems you've made interesting choices, Thornridge." Kael didn't step off the porch. "What do you want, Voss?" "Oh, nothing but neighborly courtesy." Voss tipped his hat toward Ishka with mock politeness. "Wanted to meet your new hand?" His glance was sharp as a thorn. Ishka didn't move, didn't blink, but her stare hardened into something unbreakable. Voss circled them slowly, like a wolf checking weak boards on a fence. "You surely know," he murmured. "Bringing one of her kind around here brings trouble. Bad fortune." He leaned, smirk sharpening. "Folks say Apache blood draws violence like flies." Ishka's jaw tightened, but she gave him nothing. Kael stepped down at last. "Watch your mouth." "Oh? Did I injure your feelings?" Voss sneered. "Never knew you to make decisions with your heart instead of your coin." His men snickered. Voss took another step forward, voice dropping. Not gentle, just crueler. "You trust her? After what her people have done? After what they are?" Heat lit Kael's chest, steady, clean anger. "Get to the point." For once Voss didn't laugh. His expression cooled. "Fine then. I'll lay it bare." He drove his cane into the dirt, dragging a long line between them. "Sell me this land. All of it. You're hanging on by splinters anyway, and with an Apache roaming the yard." His gaze slid toward Ishka. Misfortune always finds its mark. Kael didn't answer. The wind hissed against the fence posts, carrying the smell of creek water and heat. "Take the money, son," Voss said softly. Before things turn worse, Ishka moved, not beside Kael, not touching him, but stood behind him like a rooted oak, and that changed everything. Kael lifted his head. "For years," he said, voice steady as iron, "you've pushed, threatened, and whispered lies, and I kept quiet." Voss's brow twitched. "Not anymore." Kael left the porch, stood eye to eye with him. "You don't scare me. I'm not selling. Not for you, not for anyone. And you won't disrespect her again? Or send anyone who will?" For the first time, surprise cracked through Voss Emberfall's polished composure, only for fury to replace it like a shadow swallowing fire. "You're making a mistake," Voss Emberfall hissed. "Standing with her. Against me." Ishka Rayne didn't blink. Her gaze stayed level, unwavering, carrying the kind of strength that didn't need to shout. Sun-touched skin, jaw steady, courage quiet, but unmistakable. Kael Thornridge felt it at his back like a force holding him upright. For the first time in many years, he did not bow, he did not yield, he did not break. Voss stepped back, jaw rigid. "You'll regret this, Thornridge." "Maybe," Kael answered, voice flat. "But not today." The air tightened between them like the final breath before a brawl, two men inhaling at the same moment, neither willing to step aside. Then Voss jerked his reins, mounted in a violent motion. "This land will be mine," he vowed. "One way or another." He kicked his horse hard, tearing into the road with a burst of dust. His men thundered after him. Kael remained in the settling silence, chest tight, breath harsh. Ishka stepped beside him, voice barely above the wind. "He fears you now." Kael shook his head. "No, he's angry. Fear comes later." They both knew it. Voss wasn't finished. This was only his opening strike. As sundown bled across the prairie, the wind shifted. It came rolling off the ridge in brittle, sharp waves, carrying the kind of warning seasoned ranch hands recognized in the marrow of their bones. Even the horses grew unsettled, shifting in their stalls, ears pricking toward the darkness beyond the yard. Ishka felt it too. She stepped onto the porch, braids brushing her shoulders, eyes narrowed toward the horizon where night thickened like ink. The moon hung low behind thin drifting clouds, ghost-like, unsettled. She didn't know what was coming. Not precisely, but instinct, well-honed and rarely wrong, tightened inside her. Kael and Bram Duskhelm had gone inside early after patching torn sections of fence. The ranch lay quiet except for board creaks shifting under the creeping wind. And then Ishka heard it. Not wind, not horses. Footsteps. Heavy. Quick. Intentional. Moving toward the stables. Her pulse knotted, but hesitation did not touch her. She slipped off the porch, melted into the shadows like she'd been shaped for the dark. She crouched low beside the corral fence, breath thinning, body folded into silence. 3 figures emerged, large men moving with a hunter's caution, words whispered jaggedly under breath. One held a lantern, another carried a metal can. The third swept his gaze across the yard, thumb brushing the grip of his gun. Then Ishka saw it. Oil. Not thieves. Not rustlers. Destroyers. One poured oil across stacked hay near the stalls. Another splashed it through the wide barn doors. Horses slammed hooves against wood, panicked by the sharp scent burning in their nostrils. Ishka sprang upright. "Kael!" Her voice split the night. "Fire!" One man jerked in shock. The lantern tipped, flame flickering, then touching oil. The world detonated. Fire roared upward in a violent column of orange, tearing through darkness like something alive and hungry. Heat hit her face so hard she stumbled back. Horses shrieked inside the barn, stall boards rattling beneath their hooves. Gunfire cracked immediately. Bram stumbled from the bunkhouse, rifle half raised. The first bullet struck him square in the shoulder. He spun backward and hit the dirt hard, blood spilling between his fingers. Kael burst from the doorway barefoot, half-dressed, fury burning through him. Smoke whipped around him, lit red by flames as he grabbed Bram's coat collar and hauled him behind the water trough. "Stay down," Kael growled. Then he turned and fired, steady, controlled, deadly. Shots tore back at him. One round punched splinters off the pump handle. Another ripped through a fence post inches from his cheek. Kael didn't flinch. The man who had once swallowed threats was gone. In his place stood someone carved from grit and refusal. Ishka ducked behind the side fencing, breathing sharp, mind cutting clean through panic. She didn't rush. Apache hunters didn't rush. They moved with the terrain. They circled. They waited for the angle no one guarded. And she slid into that darkness, silent as a blade finding its mark. Apache hunters didn't lunge blindly. They circled wide, slipped through shadow, struck from angles a man never anticipated. Ishka Rayne moved exactly that way, low to the ground, quiet as dusk settling over canyon walls. She slid behind the burning barn, letting the glow of the flames paint her silhouette across the dirt while remaining untouchable. Chaos worked in her favor. Gunfire cracked near the corral. Flames whipped upward, throwing sparks like angry stars. One of the attackers broke away, sprinting toward the back fields, likely realizing the blaze would draw riders from half the county within minutes. He didn't reach open ground. Ishka stepped out of the darkness just as his boots hit the narrow strip of trail between boulders. Her knife flashed, drawn not to kill, but to stop him cold. He swung wildly, startled. She moved first. A quick strike, precise, hard, and the gun flew from his grip. He froze beneath her stare, chest rising like bellows. Behind them, gunshots echoed again. Kael Thornridge shouted her name, but she never looked back. Her gaze stayed locked on the man she'd cornered. "Move again," she said softly, "and you won't get another chance." The man dropped to his knees. Two others bolted into the night, scrambling through scrub brush toward the creek, horses abandoned in their panic. Kael didn't chase them. The barn was climbing into an inferno, roof beams splitting, haystacks erupting, flames chewing through dry timber. "Get the horses!" Kael yelled. Between Kael, Ishka, and a bleeding but conscious Bram Duskhelm, they forced the side doors open. Flames lashed at them like waves of heat, smoke clawing their lungs as they dragged panicked animals outside. Hooves kicked, halters snapped, men coughed until their vision blurred. By the time it was over, half the barn was gone, black timber steaming, embers smoldering like dying stars. The ranch stood one gust of wind away from becoming ash. Kael stood in the ruin, soot clinging to his skin, eyes burning, not from smoke, but from fury sinking deeper than words. Someone had wanted him ruined, and they had not cared who died with him. Ishka stood beside him, silent and unmoving. For the first time, Kael understood. He hadn't just hired her. He needed her. Dawn dragged itself over the valley like a wounded coyote. Pale gray light swept across the charred remains of the stables. Wet ash clung to the ground. Horses paced nervously inside the makeshift pen Kael rigged after the fire. Bram Duskhelm lay inside the house, shoulder tightly bound, breath rough enough to remind him he'd almost never stood again. Kael stood on the porch, jaw locked tight, eyes raw from sleeplessness. All night he had moved back and forth, from Bram's bedside to the smoking ruin, carrying a weight he hadn't named yet. Then the door creaked. Ishka stepped out, her face steady, eyes sharp, scanning land like danger might rise from beneath the soil. Wind tossed loose braids against her cheek, dusted her shoulders in gold light. "You didn't sleep," Kael said, though the answer already rested in his voice. "Neither did you." Her gaze shifted toward the hitching post. The captured arsonist, Naren Vike, sat slumped, wrists bound tight, ankles shaking every time the breeze touched the scorched barn behind him. Fear clung to him like sweat. Kael followed Ishka's stare. "When Bram wakes, we'll take him in. Sheriff Graylin Creedmoor will want the truth." Ishka didn't respond immediately. She rested one hand at her hip, brows lowered, thinking beyond the surface. Then her voice came low, razor plain. "If you wait, Voss Emberfall will move first." Kael froze. Ishka stepped closer, speaking with the clarity of someone who had seen bad men move many times before. You know exactly how he works. He'll twist the story. Tell them you hired me to start problems. Say we burned your barn for attention. Say Bram shot himself. He'll say anything if it keeps his hands clean. Kael's jaw clenched, because every word she spoke bit into truth he didn't want to face. He'll send men into town, she continued. They'll whisper lies, plant doubts, and by the time we get there, the sheriff will already believe the wrong story. Kael stared at the rubble glowing faint in morning light. It's how men like him survive, Ishka said. Strike first, lie loud, and bury the truth before it can stand. Wind rushed across the yard, carrying smoke, loss, and dread. Kael exhaled, slow, like something inside him finally broke free. You're right. Her chin lifted, not pride, not victory, just acknowledgement. She hadn't said it to win. She said it because it was the only path forward. Kael dragged a hand over his face. Bram's too weak to ride, and I won't leave him alone. You won't, Ishka said. I'll ride with you. 2 riders can outrun trouble if they move before it wakes. Kael Thornridge watched Ishka Rayne cinch her saddle straps, her movements precise, deliberate. It won't be safe once we reach town, he warned. Nothing has been safe since the night you hired me, she answered quietly. But running from Voss Emberfall won't finish anything. Something settled in Kael's chest. Not courage, not peace, but a stark clarity that comes when a man stops pretending danger will pass him by. He nodded once. They packed fast. Kael swung his saddle onto his gelding. Ishka tightened the reins on the mare she had calmed after the fire. Naren Vike, the captured arsonist, was hoisted onto a 3rd horse, wrists tied to the saddle horn, cloth between his teeth to silence him. As Kael mounted, the sun broke over the far ridge, light spilling across the scorched barn, outlining every scar Voss had carved into the night. Ishka rode beside him, posture firm, gaze hard. When we speak, she said, we speak the truth before he spreads his lies. Kael held her eyes, steady, unwavering. Then we ride now. And they did. The horses lunged forward, dust rising behind them like a blazing trail. Naren bounced helplessly, gagged, unable to shout. The line between fear and defiance was drawn behind their hoofprints as they flew toward town. Whatever waited ahead, Kael wasn't facing it alone. Green River was already alive when they arrived, dust curling around the riders' legs as sunlight sharpened every edge of the street. The bell over the sheriff's office clanged once, loud enough to sound rehearsed, because it was. Someone had been waiting. And there he stood. Voss Emberfall. Coat clean. Boots polished, hair slicked back. A man dressed more for celebration than accusation. Onlookers swarmed around him like churchgoers around a preacher. He tipped his hat to someone's child, smiled at a shopkeeper, shook hands like he was the town's blessing instead of its curse. Then his eyes landed on Ishka, and his expression hardened into manufactured outrage. There, he shouted, pointing straight at her. That Apache woman is the one who attacked my men. She stabbed one and shot at another, left the rest half dead. Voices flared across the crowd. She looks dangerous. Always trouble from their kind. Shouldn't let someone like that ride free. Ishka didn't shrink. Her spine remained tall, chin raised, gaze level. Kael still saw it, the cut of pain behind her eyes. Brief, sharp, buried before anyone else could notice. The saloon doors swung open. Sheriff Graylin Creedmoor stepped out, hat tipped low, thumbs hooked into his belt like he'd rehearsed the posture in a mirror. His eyes weren't evaluating anything. They were already aligned. "Ma'am," Sheriff Creedmoor called. "I'm going to need you to dismount. Calm and slow." "She isn't going anywhere," Kael said, voice cutting through the square like a hammer on steel. Silence dropped. Kael stepped forward, dropping from the saddle, placing himself between Ishka and the sheriff. Dust drifted around his boots as his shadow stretched long across the ground. "She saved my ranch," Kael said, loud enough for every ear. "She fought the men who burned my barn down. One of them nearly killed Bram Duskhelm." Gasps rippled through the crowd. "And if she hadn't been there," Kael continued, "we'd be burying bodies instead of tending to horses." Voss scoffed, loud and smug. "He's lying. He's covering for her. Who else would savage his attack but my hired hands?" Kael's eyes narrowed slowly. "Funny," he said. "Your men didn't wear your cattle brand, just masks, guns, and enough oil to turn a barn into a funeral pyre." The sheriff shifted, uneasy, glancing toward Voss. "Sheriff," Voss barked, "arrest her." Sheriff Creedmoor stepped forward, but a cracked, ragged voice yelled from the far edge of the crowd. "Wait!" Heads turned. Naren Vike stumbled into view, one side of his shirt torn open, ribs bruised from Kael's tackle the night before. He held himself upright with sheer panic, pointing straight at Voss. "I ain't taking the fall for this," he rasped. "You hired us, paid us good, to burn that barn." The square froze. "You shut your mouth," Voss snarled. But Naren was past fear. "You said the Apache girl would get blamed. Said the sheriff would back you without asking questions. Said you owned this whole damn town." Gasps, murmurs, boots scraping back. Suspicion cracked wide open. Sheriff Creedmoor's jaw clenched, badge glinting uselessly on his chest. Voss lunged, but two townspeople stepped between him and Naren, blocking his path. For the first time in years, Voss Emberfall's power broke, and everybody saw it. Then a few more voices rose, then a fourth, then a fifth, until a wall of townspeople gathered around Voss Emberfall, closing in tight with every shaken breath. Someone spoke under their breath. "Burnin' a man's barn? That ain't right." Another whispered. "He tried to kill Bram Duskhelm." "Did he hire gunmen against his own neighbor?" Kael Thornridge stepped forward, voice steady as iron. "This is the man you're defending, Sheriff. Not justice, not law, just money." Sheriff Graylin Creedmoor swallowed hard. For the first time, the badge on his chest looked too heavy. One of the older ranchers, hat tilted back, called out, "Sheriff, do your job." Graylin's hand lifted, not toward Ishka Rayne, toward Voss Emberfall. "Voss Emberfall," he said stiffly, "you are under arrest." Silence rolled through the square like a dry wind. Nothing moved except the frayed edges of the American flag beating against the saloon wall. When the cuffs snapped shut, Voss erupted, his voice wild, desperate. "You'll regret this, Thornridge, and you, Apache girl, this town will never—" Bang! The jail door slammed, sealing his voice behind iron and oak. Ishka remained on her horse, breath tight, not from fear, but from something far rarer. Vindication. Not all white towns spat venom. Not every sheriff bowed to power. Not all justice twisted itself into lies. Kael looked up at her, nodded. Quiet, steady, full of unspoken truth. Together they had shifted the current. They rode back beneath a bruised evening sky, clouds moving low and purple above the plains. The air carried that hollow stillness that comes after a storm. Not rain, but rage, and truth dragged into daylight. Their horses thudded across dry ground as they followed the narrow trail toward home. Neither spoke. Town dust still clung to them, like smoke that refused to fade. Voss arrested. Naren Vik's confession. The crowd's stunned stillness, all of it replayed in their minds like fresh wounds. When they reached the ridge overlooking the ranch, Kael slowed. The sky had turned indigo. One lantern glowed near the house, flickering like a promise that despite destruction, the land still stood. Ishka glanced over, but Kael wasn't looking at the burned barn or the fractured fence line. He stared forward, jaw hard, coat hanging heavy across his shoulders. Something inside him weighed more than anger, more than the day's battle. When they reached the old fire pit behind the house, Kael dismounted. He tied the reins loosely, lowered himself onto a rough log near the cold ashes. The lantern flame softened the hard edges of his face, lines carved by years of holding things alone. Ishka waited, unsure whether to sit until he finally spoke. "I haven't said this to anyone in a long time." She sat opposite him, quiet, attentive. "You asked me once," Kael said, "why I hold on to this land, why I don't run, why I won't bend." Ishka didn't nod, but her eyes told him she remembered. "My folks," he said. His throat tightened. "They weren't rich, weren't powerful. All they wanted was to work our piece of land, raise stock, live quiet." Ishka lowered her gaze, listening. "But the man who owned half the valley wanted ours too," Kael continued. "When my father refused, he made sure nobody traded with us, cut our fences, poisoned our well." His voice thinned, rough with memory. "And when that didn't scare us off," he swallowed, "he sent men with torches." Ishka's breath stilled. Kael's hands trembled, not fear, but remembering fire that still lived in his blood. "I was 12, he murmured. "I remember the heat, the roof falling, hearing my mother scream." Wind moved through the grass, a soft breath against a story edged in flames. "They didn't survive," Kael whispered. "And the land they fought for was swallowed into that bastard's ranch within a year." Silence settled heavy. "And ever since," he said, voice steadying, "I swore nothing would be taken from me again. Not by Voss Emberfall. Not by any man with money and a polished coat." He looked at Ishka now, eyes raw, open, honest. "This ranch is the first thing I ever built with my own hands. And today, when you stood beside me..." His voice lowered, barely more than breath. "I finally didn't stand alone. When you didn't flinch today," Kael Thornridge murmured, "not even when half the town spat venom your direction. You reminded me of them." He paused, words sifting through him like gravel, moving inside memory. "My parents, what it felt like to stand beside people who didn't bend." Something tightened deep in Ishka Rayne's chest, an ache she did not expect. She had survived exile, cruelty, and long stretches of land where no one claimed her. Pain had shaped her bones the way winter shapes driftwood. Silence had been her shield. She knew the price of remembering. But she had not expected Kael's story to echo her own. "You carry fire," Kael said quietly. "Not the kind that burns everything down, but the kind that refuses to go out." She looked away, blinking against warmth rising behind her eyes. No one had ever said anything like that. Not with respect, not with truth, not with recognition earned through shared scars. The wind shifted, brushing her cheek like the back of a familiar palm. And for the first time in a long, wandering life, something in her softened. Not in weakness, but in knowing someone had seen the fire that kept her walking. 2 lives marked by flames. 2 souls shaped by endurance. Now sitting under the same lantern glow, not apart, but parallel. She met his gaze again, and this time, she didn't turn away. The days that followed settled into a new kind of quiet. Quiet with purpose. quiet with recovery. With Voss Emberfall locked behind iron bars and his men scattered into the hills, the valley breathed easier. Even the wind felt lighter, as if danger had loosened its grip. But the ranch carried its wounds openly. The burned stable stood half-collapsed, timbers scorched and brittle. Fence rails leaned like old men after a long beating. The creek near the pasture ran sluggish, choked with ash. Everything Kael owned had been shaken to its bones. But he wasn't rebuilding alone. Ishka rose long before dawn, braids swinging, steps steady, expression sharpened with focus. She checked water lines, cleared debris, soothed horses that still flinched at the scent of smoke. And she read tracks, boar, coyote, even a stray stirrup print, with clarity that made Kael stop and marvel. She worked with the same precision she fought with, measured, efficient, never wasting movement or words. Kael watched sometimes, not out of curiosity, but with something deeper. Respect, admiration, and a feeling he refused to name before its time. Bram Duskhelm, shoulder stiff after the gunshot, stood leaning against the fence rail most mornings, offering complaints like they were gospel. "You're swinging that hammer wrong," he grumbled one afternoon. Ishka didn't glance up as she drove another nail into the new support beam, her voice calm. "If it's wrong, why is the board straight?" Bram snorted. "Lucky strike." 14 boards, she replied, all straight. Kael laughed under his breath. Bram shot him a glare, equal parts false irritation and buried pride. Later, after Ishka hauled an armload of lumber without stopping once, Bram scratched at his beard and muttered toward Kael. "Girl's tougher than rawhide, stubborn as a mule, but she works like 3 ranch hands rolled into one." He said it loud enough for Ishka to hear. She didn't smile, but her eyes warmed, and Kael noticed. By the end of the week, the ranch was transforming. Charred beams replaced with new timber, fresh fencing rising across pasture land like ribs stitching around a healing wound. The creek ran clearer as Ishka dug small channels, diverting the clotted water using techniques passed down from her people. Techniques Kael had never imagined, now becoming part of his land. Even the townsfolk noticed. Some rode by slowly, tipping hats. Others left supplies without asking for thanks: rope, nails, sacks of beans. One afternoon, Hira Lindale from the mercantile arrived with a tin of biscuits. She handed it to Kael, but her eyes drifted toward Ishka, working a hinge into place. "That girl saved your land," Hira whispered. Kael nodded. "More than once." Hira swallowed. "Town's talking different now. Folks say maybe they were wrong about her kind," Kael answered simply. "They were." Hira nodded, left the biscuits, and walked back toward town. And slowly, the ranch healed. And something inside Ishka healed too. She had spent most of her life moving, from camp to ridge to abandoned hunting grounds, never letting her heart stay long enough to be wounded again, never trusting that belonging existed anywhere for someone like her. But here, on land scarred and rebuilt with deliberate hands, she felt something she had not touched since childhood, a place that held her back. One evening, beneath a burnt orange sunset, Ishka rounded the corner of the house and stopped. Kael stood there, hammer in hand, studying the frame of a room he had started to build along the side of the house. A room that hadn't been there before, a room being added, for someone who no longer drifted. The window frame faced the eastern meadow, where sunrise would spill soft gold across the grass each morning. Ishka Rayne stepped closer, her breath forming a small cloud in the cold air. "What is this?" she asked quietly. Kael Thornridge didn't answer at first. He ran his thumb along the fresh edge of wood, cleared his throat like he wasn't quite sure how to use his voice. "A room," she said, her tone careful. "For who?" He finally lifted his eyes. "For you," he said. "If you choose to stay, this land will always have work, and—" He hesitated, choosing words slow, steady, deliberate. "I'd like you here." Wind swept across the yard, dust swirling around their boots. Ishka stared at that unfinished frame. Raw walls, open window, a space carved not from obligation, but intention. Something warm loosened deep inside her. Slow, fragile, real. For the first time since her people moved on, for the first time since she had walked alone through hostile land, she wondered whether the word home might belong to her again. Winter came early. Snow drifted down in soft sheets, settling across the prairie like a quilt sewn by patient hands. The rebuilt barn stood strong against the white horizon. Smoke rose from the chimney, curling into the pale dusk. Every fence rail shimmered faintly beneath a thin frost. Inside, fire snapped and danced along the hearth, spreading steady warmth through the cabin. Ishka stepped in from brushing frost off the horses, cheeks flushed, snowflakes clinging to her braids like scattered stars. Kael stood by the fireplace, leaning one hand against the mantel. He was a hard-set man by nature, quiet, weathered, unyielding as the land he worked. But something in him trembled, not like fear, but like a man shifting beneath the weight of what mattered. Ishka noticed immediately. Kael Thornridge didn't shake unless the ground inside him shifted. She waited, patient as still water. Finally, Kael breathed out one long, tired breath. He turned toward her, fire painting amber along the sharp lines of his face. "Ishka," he murmured, voice coarse as winter wind. "This ranch has seen more loss than any land should hold." A pause, heavy enough to fill every quiet space. "And I've carried more of it than I ever say aloud." He looked down at his hands, scarred from work, from fire, from past wrongs that refused burial. "But since the day you stepped on this land, something changed." Warmth moved through Ishka's chest, steady, unmistakable. "You brought life back to this place," Kael said. "Back to me." The fire crackled, wood hissing like distant rain. "If you stay," he continued, voice tightening around truth, "if you choose this, I'd like it to be ours, not just mine." Silence rested between them. Not empty, but full. Ishka lifted her gaze, scanning the walls he had built, shelves carved by his hands, the lantern swinging gently with the draft, the window overlooking fields she had helped defend. She remembered when she first arrived, carrying exile, suspicion, solitude like old wounds. But here, she wasn't invisible. She didn't have to shrink. She didn't have to leave before she belonged. She stepped closer, firelight catching the soft line of her jaw. "I never planned to stay anywhere," she said. "Life kept pushing me down trails that led nowhere, some lonely, some cold." She met his eyes, unflinching, vulnerable, unguarded. "But this place," her voice warmed, "it listens, the land remembers, and the man who owns it doesn't turn away." Kael waited. Every future he dared to imagine hung on the breath she drew next. Ishka reached out, brushing her fingers over the mantle he had sanded smooth. She turned toward the window, the fields washed in silver, the barn lifted back to strength, smoke rising like a promise into the sky. Then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I'll stay." Relief didn't break across Kael's face. It softened him quietly, untying knots he'd carried since childhood flames. He stepped nearer, not touching her yet, but close enough for her to feel the solid warmth of him, the certainty of what he offered not with grand words, but with a room built in her name. Outside, winter brushed the valley with a calm wind. Inside, two hearts, once weathered by different fires, found rhythm in the same place. That night, beneath the season's first blanket of snow, something rooted, slow, sure, like dawn rising over the western plains. A beginning shaped not by survival, but by choice. And a home built not from timber alone, but from trust. Finally, let me send my deep thanks to you. Thank you for giving your time to this story. Some journeys shape us, and we hope this one left a mark on your heart. There are more paths ahead, more legends of love, hardship, and redemption beneath the western sky. Please subscribe, leave your thoughts, and travel with us once again. Thank you, and God bless. Aviso legal. Disclaimer. The stories presented here are creative expressions and may mix historical inspiration with dramatized scenes. AI tools contribute to some elements of voice, imagery, and structure, but every published story is refined by editors and creators to ensure authentic emotional impact. We honor YouTube's policies and do not generate deceptive likenesses or artificial depictions of real people. All audiovisual components are legally licensed. Any use, redistribution, or alteration of this content must be granted through written consent. Your presence here means a lot. Thank you for supporting artistic storytelling.